we are again. It's been a wonderful journey, and I believe you have been enjoying these episodes. Wow, the Passover. Hmm? The Passover? What is it? Well, let's get deeper. In our discourses, we have really identified very important themes as far as the sojourn of Moses is concerned. And in this particular episode, I would want you to very much pay a particular attention to these important statements as we go through the Passover. I believe you've had the opportunity to really discover very important lessons throughout our discourses. In this episode, of course, like we do, I would like us to tow a particular direction. We would look at the warning, the preparation, the blood and the yeast, and quickly delve into what it really means to remember and to teach. And finally, the plague that we have been waiting for, the 10th plague. The warning. In antiquity, especially in the context of history, we've had the privilege to experience historical facts with regards to natural disasters. Well, they may sound a bit worrying, but these are references where we can learn very important lessons. Unlike various natural disasters that have ever happened, the Mount Vesuvius, within the time of the 1st century AD, around 60 to 65 AD, was very tempestuous, and it gave varying signs, even though the people in those times never really understood perfectly how it was going to cause devastation. And it did, to the extent that it buried the whole city of Pompeii. And that brings to my mind, what was the warning? The final warning, of course, which was about to be told to the Pharaoh. It is very clear, according to our discourses, that there were about 3 days of darkness, and this actually proved very important in the life of Pharaoh himself, to the extent that it actually changed his whole demeanor. It is recorded that he was angry. Well, you would have expected that this man would change, but unfortunately he becomes angry to the extent that he forbids Moses from returning to the palace. But like I said earlier, sometimes you would really want to cling to a friend or a loved one such that you can save them from an impending doom. But in this case, Pharaoh, like he has always been, was adamant. So what choice did Moses have? Well, initially, he could not obey the order of Pharaoh not to step in the palace, because he knew that the Pharaoh's firstborn, whose life was hanging in the balances, had to be saved. Unfortunately, his warnings were not heeded, and the time of divine judgment had come. Clearly, for the proud, arrogant, and exploitative, punishment and obligation to return was to be extorted. Again, for the obedient, it was time to pass over punishment and to be freed. And this quickly turns the journey all around, from the head to the toe. And clearly, the Israelites were now commanded to prepare for one of the most important journeys ever recorded in the first books of Moses, the Pentateuch. The preparation is one of the most important times that ever happened to those who found themselves in Egypt just before the Exodus. They were given clear instructions, and as we will discover, the various important statements that were made are going to be excavated and carefully discussed. We see that God had explained what the Israelites had to do. In fact, the word Pesach, which means the Passover as we have come to know, was a very important word in that time. Basically because they were being told, that is the Israelites, to have a clear instruction with which they were supposed to follow thoroughly without any inch of disobedience. On the 10th day, they were to set aside a lamb without defect for each family or for several families. And as we have seen, the detailed instructions highlighted God's meticulous and clear instruction, which is entirely His initiative. And the Hebrew text emphasizes that He would pass through. And this shows perfectly who was acting as the active agent. Not merely sending an angel, this time it was God Himself. The Passover, the Hebrew, as I have already said, the Pesach implies to pass over, to hover over, to spare. And it's not just a physical passing by, but an act of protection and deliverance. And through this, we see various commentaries that discuss how important this event was. As already read, they were supposed to set aside a lamb. The word tamim means whole, complete, sound, blameless, or in other words, perfect. And this requirement for the lamb foreshadows the perfect sinless sacrifice of Christ. It doesn't end there. It also speaks to the purity and holiness required for atonement. And rabbinic tradition has extensive discussions on what constitutes a defect. Clearly, even a minor blemish could render the animal unfit. But when you look closely to the first instruction, according to the 12th chapter of Exodus, the 3rd to the 5th verses, God instructed that the particular lamb to be slain, of course without blemish, was to be for each family, or in rare cases for several families. This provision actually highlights the communal and familial nature of the Passover. It wasn't an individualistic act, no, but a covenant with households and the nation. It allowed for inclusivity, ensuring that even smaller families or those who were unable to procure a lamb could participate. Very, very important. As we discuss all these, you might be asking, which month is this? Of course, in the context of the instruction, this was supposed to be in the month of Nisan, where on the 10th day, the Israelites were supposed to set aside a lamb. It continues further that this particular lamb would now be slain on the 14th day. On the 14th, at dusk, they were to sacrifice. And what do we mean? This 4-day period actually allowed for a careful inspection of the lamb. How could they have searched for lambs on the same 10th day? God gave them a 4-day provision, ensuring that they could perfectly look for that lamb without blemish. It also built anticipation. The 4 days built anticipation and allowed each family to personally connect with the animal that would represent their substitute. It was not just for any instruction, but to give them ample time to prepare. 4 days was enough to get a perfect lamb. It continues that this particular sacrifice was supposed to be done at dusk. In other words, at twilight. between two evenings. In the Hebrew context, Bein Harbayim means specifically that it happened, and per popular understanding throughout theologians, around 3 p.m., connoting the same time when Jesus was being crucified and started feeling a lot of agony on the cross. This allowed enough time for all the sacrifices at the temple, because it also aligns, as already stated, with the time of Jesus' death on the cross. Perfect, isn't it? It doesn't end there. The whole story intensifies with clearer instructions. They were to anoint the doorposts with lint and lintel with the blood. Why was this necessary? Doorposts, called mezuzah, and lintel, mashkof in Hebrew, are very important articles as far as the familiar worship is concerned. The application of the blood was very significant. It was a visible sign of obedience and faith. The placement, and hear me out carefully, the placement on the sides and the top, that is the lintel, formed a kind of cross shape. Wow. On the sides, the lintel, a cross shape. Does it ring a bell of the sanctuary? It does. And this placement symbolically marked the house. It was not to be placed on the threshold because it would be trampled upon. And this emphasized the reverence for the blood. It was very significant. This act, physical in nature, actually symbolized the spiritual application of the atoning blood. And the hyssop used for sprinkling was associated with purification in other rituals. Wow, I hope you are following. It doesn't end there. Again, the instruction was clear that they were to eat the meat completely roasted with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Finally, they were supposed to eat it hastily, and as they ate hastily, they were to be dressed and ready to go. Then, of course, just before the Exodus, or should I say, when they left Egypt, they were to continue eating the unleavened bread for 7 days. How significant is this? Well, before I delve deeper into what it means that they should have ate hastily and to dress and be ready to go, it is noteworthy for me to highlight that the blood was supposed to be a token. The blood of the lamb was a visible sign of their faith and obedience. It wasn't the blood itself that saved them, but their active trust in God's provision. Now let me go in deeper. Roasted whole, not boiled, but raw. Roasting the lamb whole preserved its form, symbolizing the wholeness, completeness of the sacrifice. It was not to be consumed entirely, but it was supposed to be perfectly prevented from any defilement or lingering attachment to the past, which hints at the complete giving of Christ's body himself. Then again, it follows that they were supposed to eat unleavened bread even of 7 days after the Exodus. Well, the word leaven, known as shames in Hebrew, was often a symbolization of corruption, sin, and pride. You can confirm by cross-referencing 1 Corinthians 5, verse 6 through 8. The command was to eat unleavened bread, that is, bread made quickly without time for yeast to rise, and remove all leaven from their house for 7 days, representing purity, sincerity, and the haste of departure. Basically, it marked a break from the leaven of Egypt. You may have also recognized the role of bitter herbs. The meat was supposed to be eaten with bitter herbs, and these herbs such as chicory, endive, and lettuce served as a stark reminder of the bitter servitude and affliction they had endured in Egypt. Basically, eating them alongside the lamb created a profound contrast between the bitterness of bondage and the sweetness of deliverance through God's providence. I cannot continue without noting the fact that the imagery of girding their loins with their shoes on their feet and their staff in their hand depicted a people on the verge of immediate departure. And that really follows the importance of totally aligning yourself with freedom. As we move further, it is clear that God had prepared His people to understand His grace and to worship Him. The blood and the yeast. On the 14th, two elements played very important roles in the ceremony: blood and the yeast. As we have already discovered, the yeast was supposed to be removed from the homes. Nothing to be left, because the departure was imminent. There wouldn't be any need for yeast during the initial stages. As already discussed, they had to clearly uproot all symbols of sin. Again, blood was the salvific element. It represented the blood of Christ, which He shed on the cross. Of course, the hyssop with which the blood was to be sprinkled is a symbol of purification from sin. And it's no surprise that David once said, "Cleanse me with hyssop and renew a right spirit in me, creating in me a clean heart." David really knew the importance of cleansing in the context of using the hyssop. It doesn't end there. After all these things, they are told to remember and to teach their children what had happened. God places important emphasis on didactic lessons. In other words, He expects families, progeny, to learn from our personal experiences with Him. That we have the privilege to teach them is something that God prioritizes. That we have the privilege to transfer our knowledge of His good deeds is something He does not play with, especially to our younger ones. You may be waiting for the final plague, the 10th plague. You remember I started by saying, sometimes it's so hard and you feel so much disheartened when your efforts to save your loved ones are seen in vain. Well, for Pharaoh, the 10th was the most devastating experience he had ever had. Pharaoh had ordered the killing of all Hebrew boys, without exception. At every mercy offered to him by God, this time, his last decline would now reciprocate his long-lasting sinful behaviors of killing Hebrew boys. God had determined the conditional death of only the firstborn. Conditional. In every house where the blood of the lamb was not anointed, at least one person died. And this judgment moved swiftly in full force. The judgments of God were in direct defilement of the power of the Egyptian gods. No Egyptian god raised his hand to help, nor could Pharaoh do anything to prevent the disaster. As with Pharaoh, our negative circumstances and adamant nature can bring woes to even our closest friends and family. But in the context of what Moses did, the act of one person and the incessant display of mercy and love for our friends and loved ones can bring much good. We see clearly that Moses presents faithfulness and steadfastness, which is important to save many. Are you ready to sound the warning once again? I am.